Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast with me, your host, Matthew Watts, founder and managing director of Rockbourne. This is a podcast where I share the stories, views, opinions and career journeys of the movers, shakers, innovators and leaders in the real estate industry. Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast. Today I'm joined by Phil Bayliss, CEO of Infinium Logistics. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Great to be here.
No, well, thanks for coming on. So, Phil, you've had a varied career since you entered the real estate world in 2006 as an analyst at APM Capital Investors. How did you get into property and why did you want to pursue a career in this space?
Yeah, sure. I'm Australian. Grew up, my background is I come from a family of banana growers, which doesn't have much to do with anything these days in my career, but grew up in country Australia, studied economics at university and did, I'm guessing, what a lot of listeners would have done, which is went to university, applied my trade and applied for a lot of grad roles and took a grad role in Sydney. AMP Capital is like a Legal and General or a Pru. It's the main life insurer and investor for pension fund money in Australia. They were growing at warp speed in the bull run, which I must be getting older because I have less people to share the stories of what it was like when your money was doubling every other year. And it meant things were growing fast. I joined a grad program on rotation. I was an equities analyst for some time. That was a really helpful experience in seeing what traded. And I think real estate people, if you haven't had the exposure, it's an interesting one to have, is other asset classes, and having traded heavily analysed markets wasn't for me. I had an interesting 6 months doing that, but it definitely refined. I thought I wanted to be an equities analyst.
Yeah.
And then I did it, and I thought, other than meeting with the C-suite of the listed businesses, and I was an equities analyst for real estate, which is the segue into how I got involved in real estate. That was very interesting, being part of the top table as your first job. You're meeting with these C-suite describing their headline strategy, then getting back to the work of trying to pick up pennies in front of the train and outperforming a listed index. I found a particularly brutal day-to-day job. And I found myself more interested in the strategies that the C-suite were talking about on how they run the business, motivate the people, and build an operating business. And so that led me to being more and more enthusiastic to the direct acquisition business inside AMP. So this is still in Australia, 15 years ago now. And then I ended up specialising more and more in hey, getting out and doing deals is pretty interesting, especially when you're in your early 20s. That's a particularly satisfying, fast-paced environment, and I specialised in out and buying sites and crunching the numbers, doing the numbers, running the numbers, seeing if that works for our investors, and over time ended up being a specialist in putting structures together to invest via, and did a little bit of work in Asia. And as I travelled, I thought, Australian country boy, living in Sydney, which I had no particular affinity to. And I actually just packed up, resigned with no plan, travelled the world, ran out of money. And literally, I remember I had my backpack on, everything I owned was on my back. King's Cross Station, didn't have enough money to get to my mate's house in Clapham, and that was my start of my career in London 15 years ago. And thought I better get a job was the most urgent, pressing moment when you can't even afford to buy a beer. That reminds you've definitely run out of money. And I find I tell that story sometimes, and it's playful. It was never, it was out of choice that I ran so close to the line, but. Putting myself in the deep end, early risk-taking early on in my career, and informed betting on my professional competency has paid dividends throughout my career. So that theme ends up, we'll touch on it later, but that theme ended up being the thing that evolved through my career, is putting myself in the deep end and putting myself out there. So I turned up to London. I knew one person, which is my pal I was sleeping on his couch. and started to apply for jobs, and I applied for a job at this place I'd never heard of, and it didn't quite seem to be for me. And so I resigned, actually, 3 months in, which is unlike me. I usually stick things through. And I resigned to a guy called Bill Hughes, and this was Legal and General, this place I'd never heard of. He said, all the reasons you're saying you want to leave are the reasons why I want to join and want to change. So why don't you stick around and help me make some positive changes? And then I had a wonderful run with some fabulous people at Legal and General who remain pals with many of my ex-colleagues, and that involved being financial analyst to start with.
Yeah.
And which, having done that, I would say is my real technical apprenticeship in business, has been business analyst, financial analyst. So connecting strategy, if you get rid of the fancy words, what are you doing? Connecting strategy to business case, and how does it make economic sense to pursue something? And that then started creating good connective tissue to, hey, there's a business case here, why don't you go and implement it as well, Phil? And so the theme that started to develop after that in my career is I've actually never had a job that exists before I did it.
You created your own path.
Yeah. And so I consistently started to try and address areas where I thought there was good opportunity. I also hopefully had some ability to be able to capture and create that opportunity, and also recognising the firm I worked at and what's their strengths and our right to compete in that opportunity. And what did that look like? It looked like property derivatives for a time. How do we better manage hedge risk, buy risk in a more efficient way for property funds at Legal and General? And then subsequently, we were getting more and more proactive with how we might be able to utilise L&G's balance sheet as opposed to third-party money. So we started to do things, and this is what I built a more and more fascination for, is as I got close to investors, their eagerness to want to write a prospectus, lock down an investment idea, and then go and deliver that for many years felt like quite an outdated approach. I could understand the context from an investor's point of view. They want to know what they're signing up to.
Yeah.
But for a dynamic capital market where often value sits just outside that cookie cutter, I was eager to make sure that I was working in an environment where we pursue opportunity. We don't review prospectus information around allowable investments.
Yeah.
And with Bill Hughes' help at L&G, I got more and more of that sort of sponsorship and worked with the likes of Laura Mason and Nigel Wilson, who remains a group CEO there. They're very proactive around utilising the capital to pursue opportunities others can't, using patient money to build, cathedral building really worthwhile business case, not on a 4 or 5 year PE cycle, but really pursuing things for long-term value creation. So bought a house builder called Carla Homes. I was lucky enough to serve on the board of that for a time. And then again created another area in Legal and General Capital, which was at the time a small team dedicated to investing L&G's own money into interesting investment ideas. And so I started to, if going back to the start, I sort of went from traded assets, homogeneous asset class, highly tradable, into direct unlisted assets, more eccentric, and then more into private equity operating platforms with a real estate footprint. I worked with a great guy called Dan Batterton, and me and him worked for probably too long than we'd like to admit on trying to establish the build-to-rent business in Legal and General, and I was on the balance sheet side, and Dan was building the team, building the operating platform. And then as I was doing that, it was pretty obvious that L&G is the biggest pension provider in the country. Retirement is in our DNA, and the link between building great environments for people to thrive and what we're doing for retirees in the UK, it was quite coherent that we should have a retirement community offering. And then I was lucky enough to meet, reviewed many in the industry, and then we closed a deal with a business called Inspired Villages, and I still chair that. I'm executive chairman of Inspired Villages, and the evolution of that went to looking at 2 sites. We now have a £6 billion portfolio. That's 5 years on. We've got a tremendous partnership with NatWest Pension Fund, which is the UK's largest private pension, and Legal and General, and that business is thriving. When I teamed up with Jamie and the team with Legal and General, there was 4 main executives and 20 in the business, and now there's about 350 in the business, and that's thriving. The theme on the businesses that have done really well there is often making the tough decisions on behalf of customers, putting the customer first, to the extent you can, just digitise, and where there isn't legacy, make sure you use that as an opportunity to digitise and automate and standardise, so you can elevate everyone's thinking to do higher order, higher value thinking. And then making sure you establish the mandate for people to just get on and do their best work. So, not getting caught up in the what's allowable as a funding mandate, or we want people thinking, what is the most amount of value I can create for our customers, and how can we capture some of that? So that was 14 years at Legal and General, wonderful time. During lockdown, I did reflect on what I want to do with my life, like a lot of people. I had a 1 and a 3-year-old at home as well, which made that the sensation of lockdown a little bit more extreme as well.
Moved out from your mate's couch.
Yeah, exactly. and I was on holiday with a pal of mine, funny enough, and during lockdown, and we were just after lockdown, and we were talking about what each other do, and James Lee, who's the executive chairman of Infinium Logistics, which I'm the CEO of, at the time, he, as far as I knew, you know how you're pals with someone and you just have no idea what they do.
Yeah.
And I'd describe all my friends like that, and I thought I knew what he did, and he did car parks and chickens. I didn't know what that meant, but that's what he did. And then, as I got to know more over holiday with his family, he was on endless phone calls with one of the world's biggest logistics firms. I thought, how is this linked to what you do?
Yeah.
And he said, well, when I say I do car parks and chickens, I'm a energy saving expert, and I do energy saving as a service is my background. Okay. And so how does that to do with logistics? And I was like, well, it turns out I know a lot of car parking, and there's an immediate urgency in the market during lockdown because of so much e-commerce growth. There's so much volume that's come through that the amount of parcels that can go through warehouses now does not match the parking availability for vans to get a parcel to our door. And this wouldn't be news to anyone in the logistics sector that it's people, power and parking is the 3 main issues facing a lot of operators in the logistics space. And he was well suited to address parking. So zoomed forward a year and he's got 10,000 vans on his books, parking vans on a temporary basis for loads of logistics providers. And we over many catch-ups and beers at the pub, we sort of, there's a property play here, and they're potentially a very interesting property play. And it actually started, and this is worth dwelling on a little bit. It actually started in the wrong direction. We thought we were going to repurpose all the car parks in the country.
Yep.
And that was the initial pitch. And what we realised is the most pressing is actually more in the middle mile. And so we redesigned our business twice before we got going. And I don't mind saying that because it was an important change that made a huge difference to our business, because what I stumbled upon, which has been the feature since so I joined here a year ago now.
Yeah.
And we've got the world's first EV fleet hub. We've Fleet Hub Fund. We've overcommitted our fund. We're oversubscribed. We've got a tremendous amount of support. I've been lucky enough to present to 6 or 7 of the world's biggest investors, and they've all invested with us. So we've had a tremendous run. And what is that? It is, we're solving the problem for fleets transitioning to electric vehicles.
And there's a mandate in the UK to get 2030.
Yeah.
Is that right? And Amazon is certainly driving a lot of green vans, and no doubt DPD and DHL and all the other couriers are as well. And that's what you're trying to capture, or get ahead of the curve, or service them.
It was certainly thought number 2. Thought number 1 was the average parcel volume's gone up probably 20, 30, 40, 50% in warehouses, and and the bit that cannot, robotics and automation can deal with a lot of that volume.
Yeah.
What can't deal with that volume is there's only so many parcels you can get into a van with a man on a 12-hour shift. And so van volume goes up almost straight line with parcel volume. Now there's coincidence rate, drop rates, out-of-home delivery. There's a few other nuance to that that logistics experts know better than I do. But that was the first thought. The second thought then went, the far bigger trade here by a magnitude of 10x is, the layman speak, is the amount of money being spent at the petrol pump, and that being transitioned into real estate value.
Yeah.
And so the transition to electric vehicles, the willingness from logistics providers high, access to infrastructure exceptionally low. So everyone's gone straight to the easy one, which is, how many charge points can I get at my depot?
Right.
Turns out the answer is very few, almost operationally useless number. And then the really advanced players like Amazon have started to say, I'll build multi-story and get hundreds of them on my depot. But often a lot of developers are saying, I'm not that interested in building a super bespoke parking and charging offer if not everyone else would want that. There's a residual complication. And so our play is simple. We go to customers, go to logistics providers and say, bring your electric vehicles to us. We're located in all the prime industrial locations across the country and across Europe. Park and charge your vehicles, and then over time, more fleet as a service. So we're working with some of the major manufacturers to see if we can bring van servicing, damage control, AI interaction with damage at exit and at entry, fleet cleaning, and then the charging. I like to use a pithy little example to just put this in context. We charge, roughly, the market charges something like £5 to £10 a day. It obviously depends what bit of real estate, to park a van in a prime industrial location. If you look at the numbers, the average van spends is about £60 to £70 a day on diesel, and to charge that same diesel van in EV is about 15. So there's about £45, or probably 10x the value creation for a customer to transition to EV. Now there's a cost to that EV van, but
of course,
in simple operational sense. And talking to real estate guys, and the reason we're working with you guys, getting some fabulous talent into this business, is if done well, I see no reason that Infinium Logistics won't be of the scale of some of the major oil players. And why is that? Because we can interact with most of the power producers. We're finding on most of our sites we can produce on-site about a third of the power we require. The other 2/3 we can produce off-site, or work with producers who are well established in renewables. So it has to come from renewable, otherwise don't bother.
Yeah, and is that solar on site?
Yeah. And then you start thinking about the value capture and the tonnage and miles that are done in the UK. The vast majority of tonnage and miles is fleet. But fleet is only 6 million of the 30 million vehicles on the road. Yet all the EV infrastructure focus has been quick, let's get a welcome break or a moto charging point.
Yeah, on the councils in the side of the lamppost.
Exactly. And it turns out you can't get an 8 metre... You can't get that 8 metre DPD van parked in that. It's just not appropriate for a fleet user to turn up to a lot of these. So we think the focus has been in the wrong direction. And so that's the problem we've solved. We've had a fabulous start to the business, and found the customer-centric approach has done us well. The obsession with the operation. So surprisingly, for a predominantly real estate business, there's few real estate people here. And there's a lot of logisticians and ex-Amazonians, ex-DHL, ex-DPDs here.
Yeah.
And we dial up their voices in every meeting to make sure we're obsessed by customer outcome. The things I've had to learn, I wasn't a logistics expert, and I certainly wasn't an investment logistics person before we started here. And I've spent a lot of time sitting next to our chief operating officer, who used to run the south of Amazon Logistics, getting up to speed. What does cost per shipment really mean? Let's get to the bottom of exactly what costs are driving a lower cost per shipment to get a parcel to your door. And that's how we think about it. And then we zoom back and say, what is our mission? We're here to decarbonise mobility. And the fabulous bit, the extension, thought 3. So thought 1 was we've got a parking crisis.
Yeah. Thought
2 was, actually it turns out that the transition to EV is a far bigger opportunity than the parking crisis. And then, so that's thought 2. And then thought 3 was, if we're putting all this infrastructure in, putting a public forecourt available to others almost owes us nothing. We've already put the connection issue, we've bought the access to power, and therefore we can get to market and offer a really high quality experience, charging experience to the public or semi-public, as in fleet owners who want to come in for a short-term high-powered charge.
Yeah.
And then the extensions to this, and the sort of, as part of what Rockbourne's been helping us recently, is the extensions to this thought process, which has been the wonderful transition out of big business, is the agility to turn strategy into action. Is we've now identified that exists with trucks, and to those in the market, that's no news. That's an obvious thought, but it probably sadly took me too long to get there. But now we're doing something about that too. So we're about to launch the equivalent of fleet hubs for trucks as well, and starting to think hard around what sustainable fuels will win, energy density around payloads. So starting to get quite technical and engineering around how do we create the right infrastructure footprint that's safe, secure, and CO2 neutral for a transition for trucks as well as vans.
And does that I don't know the trucking space that well, but from what I've heard, HGV drivers are difficult to come by, difficult to retain. But by offering this product and probably better amenities alongside the product, the hope is it'll give a better experience for the truck drivers. There'll be less of them leaving. And so from a fleet perspective, they'll be able to retain talent for longer.
Yeah.
And put them in, take better care of them fundamentally as well.
Yeah. And that has to be at the core of the offering. I think, there's what I call sort of hygiene things, and the hygiene things in the truck market will be the transition to EV or hydrogen. And I haven't met someone who factually knows which way that's going to go yet, but the transition to a clean fuel solution is a hygiene fact. It's got to work. It's got to be. I've got to have access to plenty of fuel. There's a resilience piece that the fleet manager will need to know. There's a whole bunch of very sensible, resilient business process that needs to be designed around truck stops. They need to minimise cargo theft, which is a huge thing. Your point around it was interesting, wasn't it, when we came through in the pandemic, and roles that perhaps a lot of us hadn't thought of, key roles that keep our lives moving. And what became obvious is it turns out truck drivers are very important to nearly everything that we do, but they're not treated that way. And if you go to any average truck stop, you see the working environment that they have, and it's quite a punishing one. Yep. They work long hours, heavily regulated, for the most part can be quite lonely, can be quite dangerous, and the physical aspect is difficult to keep fit, difficult to eat well. And so part of the, and Infinium oozes this at every point, but the part of, my own personal mission is to leave this world better than I joined it. When we talk about ESG, I find that's too cold a point, and I'd rather talk about person-centred improvement, and worker welfare for trucks is a great example of that. where the little changes you can make from an experience there beyond just the economics means that it's always occupied, and it's full. So it makes good economic sense. You don't just have to be the nice guy. It makes economic sense to have a gym on site, to have a healthy food offering, to have better sleeping arrangements, all sorts of those combinations then leads to our customers saying, hey, we're now attracting a new sort of truck driver. We're attracting better talent. We're making available training facilities on our sites so they can grow professionally in the skills that they adapt. They can stay up to date with all the regulations through every country they drive through, all of that good stuff. So at that opportunity, there's 150,000 trucks every day that park illegally across the UK and Europe.
Wow.
And it doesn't get enforced at the moment because the economy would grind to a halt. But they have no other option because nearly every decent truck stop in Europe is full. And so they park on the side of the road, and I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but the things you learn along the way is you're not supposed to be parking up for overnight in lay-bys on the side of roads, but drive down the A5 on any given evening, and you'll see what I mean. There'll be thousands of trucks on the side. So that opportunity into our right to compete and to get out into the market has been a thoroughly enjoyable one, backed by some terrific investors. But none of this comes together without good talent. So I think the journey I've described today has mostly been nearly entirely built around great talent joining, picking up ideas, creating ideas, and turning that into value for customers and us.
So you've gone ideas first and then retrofitted it. So you've built it and then they'll come, rather than look at the perspective as you said and then try and match it up. Yes,
yeah, and a little bit of operational flexibility here has been helpful. So we'll do something with our own money for a while, and then do it in big scale. Yeah. So often the equivalent of the prototype or the MVP in the minimum viable product in VC speak, in property, the MVP will still cost you 5 or 10 million quid. But to show people what you mean by this is what our vision for the future is, and then use that many times over.
So you raised £200 million from Greenpoint Partners, as you said earlier, oversubscribed. You've got the ability to create a £500 million portfolio initially. Just kind of coming back to the real estate piece, what real estate are you going after? You mentioned kind of car parks initially, and then you've pivoted. So from a property perspective, and the property professional listening to this, you also talk about creating a new asset class within logistics. Can you just define that or explain that further?
Yeah, thinking about our pipeline, we've got about £1 billion worth of real estate under review at the moment, and if I was to generalise, I'd say that's 2 to 10 acres. It needs a lot of power, which depends where it is, can be a challenge. So we will need, rule of thumb is we need roughly 1 MVA per 100 vans. Most of our customers want 100 to 200 vans, and often in locations we'll have several customers that will want to co-locate. And you can get roughly 60 vans an acre, to just give you a feel. So most of our pipeline is 2 to 10 acres. What do they look like? We try not to compete head-on with what would be a regular shed development.
Yeah.
And so, unsurprisingly, the side of a railway, a quirky shaped bit of land, I don't think we own a standard lot in our business yet. I can't think of one. They're triangles, they're long slithers, they're the odd bits, the unloved odd bits in industrial locations for the most part. And what are we going to do with that? We are going to put in significant civils and infrastructure upgrade, often have to upgrade local power station or substation. Yeah. And then for the most part it's van storage, so it'll be put solar panels on everything we can possibly the most we can produce on site, the better. We'll have battery storage. We have a power trading strategy. There's a technological piece to this around fleet management that I mentioned earlier, which is around damage control on entry and exit and recognition, possibly even booking straight into a servicing. There's cleaning and then charging. So there's a whole life cycle of fleet ownership, and then everything associated with the workers and the worker welfare that they'd need on site. Swindon was our first site as a little case study. That was a park and ride, an ex-park and ride, and it turns out that one thing we hadn't contemplated, and then it came at us pretty quickly, was all of us are working agile now. Very, very few people are commuting to London anymore in volume. And so all of the old traditional park and rides where you park off-site, get a bus to a train and then train into London feels like quite a foreign thought now.
Yeah.
So a lot of disused, and that was already being used as a parking asset. So utilise that. That's a triangular shape, not perfect for efficient shed development and site cover. We were the most competitive bid, and now we have a site going in for planning next week for several hundred van storage and charging. And it will have 15 public high-powered DC chargers to help the community transition to EV as well.
What are the biggest challenges? Is power the biggest challenge?
It's a real mix. We're across Europe, so doing business across several countries is a challenge.
Yep.
Property ultimately is a local business, and building teams locally to execute is probably one of the biggest challenges. Getting the right people is the biggest challenge, actually. Building the team, finding the right talent that also matches. I think a lot of people want to be involved in an early startup until they're involved in an early startup. Yeah. And
they like the romantic idea of it.
Yeah. There isn't anyone that doesn't want to maximise their own personal influence and impact, and I think that's a good positive thought is, how can I be involved in something where I really make a difference? And you absolutely can in a small business, but a bit like, I've got young kids and it's a bit like being a dad, is you can't then switch it off though. You're a dad all the time, and when you're working, you're in a small startup, you're working all the time. You can't drop the ball and switch off. And so finding people with the right professional background, the right balance of skills that enjoy the startup environment, as well as because ultimately, the people who back us are the funds that back us are global pension funds. Some of the world's biggest pension investors are lucky enough to be our to support us and be the LPs in our fund. So they expect the institutional grade workforce and institutional grade reporting, the way we approach and investment underwriting. But yet in a startup, you'll be buying bus tickets one moment and then launching a fund the next. So being in that environment, that's probably been one of the biggest challenges. The technical aspects of real estate, time rather than I'd necessarily say power. So, if you go to West London at the moment, you can't get power for love nor money for the most part. And so it depends where you go. Other areas, and we've got a site in Croydon, and it looks like we'll have all our immediately available power instantly. So it differs. At Swindon, as the example, we've secured power of 3 MVA. It's taking us 30 months to get in the queue, and that's something I was unfamiliar with when we got going.
Yeah.
And being a pretty pure capitalist, I thought, how can I jump the queue? What do I have to pay? How do we do? No. You just pay a small deposit and sit there and wait. And I recently wrote an op-ed on this point exactly, is as we decarbonise as a society and we move towards renewable energy into electricity, and our use of electricity goes up, we absolutely have to find a better way to upgrade and utilise the grid and make those who are finding the most economically useful use of power to get to the front of the queue. It's staggering that we all just join the same queue, even though
you're further advanced in the learnings that and the journey you've been on. You could sharing economy, you could help give someone a leg up.
Yeah.
And learn from what you've learned.
And so power is certainly an issue. Planning permission. My time with Inspired Villages, I'm still privileged to be the executive chairman there, and got a fabulous team and an incredible planning track record. But my involvement with that business, it's been incredibly slowed down by planning bureaucracy, and the UK planning system needs a significant overhaul. I couldn't say it would be anything other than a almost start again. But there's no incentive for local authorities to give you planning permission. They have to deal with the admin, and the local politicians have to have the threat of, if they say yes, getting voted out at the next election. And we haven't found a revenue model for local authorities to say you should be incentivised like a federated state in Australia or the US. Local governments are incentivised to provide a competitive environment to encourage local investment. And in the UK, it encourages a NIMBY, don't do it here, because we don't see any upside from it. And so it's a long-winded, I've got quite a lot in my mind about planning at the moment, but power would be one, planning is another one, which is we really need as an industry to get together and work out how do we help. Industry needs to lead government and find a way that isn't just self-centred, driving our own commercial interests, but how do we find a way forward where planning permission is first and foremost a benefit for the local community in either economics, in pure revenues, that they get more public services paid because they've issued a planning permission, and time. So how do we make sure we get these quicker? And time kills all things. And my experience with Inspired is when I came out of LNG, I vowed I wouldn't build a business around contentious planning permissions because you get locked up in time. And here I am with lots of planning permissions again. So I suspect planning will be the other one that leads to time delays.
Planning, power, people.
Yes.
Is the kind of the 3 Ps that cause the problem.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in our industry, people still get pigeonholed, and they get casted as a retail specialist or a logistics specialist or a residential specialist. You've moved from the listed equity analyst space to working on a broad range of sectors to being a living or later living specialist, then probably not knowing so much about the logistics space, to creating a new asset class within it. What advice would you give to someone who wants to move out of a sector where they feel pigeonholed, or they're told that they're pigeonholed, and they want to broaden their experience?
Be very purposeful about where you want to work and what you want to do. I think being an Aussie in the UK has allowed me to get away with some behaviour traits that might otherwise not be allowable if I had a British accent. Those that know me would smile and know what I mean by that, quite forceful and purposeful when I set my mind to something. And it surprises me how inactive or lack of proactivity a lot of people have in their career. They bumble along, things are okay, and then they get frustrated that something's not working out and there's not enough opportunity in front of them. And my experience, there's 2 things to that. I think my experience is there's not enough risk takers in the world, and I don't mean blind cowboy risk taking of things you're not capable of managing. Good informed risk taking needs to be done a lot more, and the British economy needs to have more economic incentive for risk takers, and we need to build a better culture of taking risks. So my advice for early in career is take enough risk to make you quite nervous. Professional risk. Push yourself out there. Something that comes easy to me but not others sometimes is networking and getting to know. Ultimately, most of my best ideas weren't my ideas. They came from a great discussion and a lively debate with someone else, and I needed that with another conversation. And nearly every problem I solve is via my network, and every idea I come up with was knitting things together from my network. So have a wide, diverse network. Take quite a lot of risk. Really push yourself out into the deep end, and you'll find your skills are transferable across. And I find there's very few niche specialist skills that aren't transferable. They're usually, even if it feels quite micro, it's quite a transferable skill. And it's force yourself to have the exposure. Don't wait for the invite.
Yeah, I think it's really good advice. And I always say, if you're good enough, you'll find a way, rather than being labelled. So just looking to the future, you've got an awful lot on your plate, and you've clearly achieved a hell of a lot in the year that you've been here. What does the future look like for Infinium?
very busy year this year. I suspect we'll fully commit the fund probably by the first half of next year. And we'll reflect on all the investors in there looking at this fund saying, looks really interesting, show me you can deploy, do what you say you do, and also do it in some volume. And if we can do it in volume, I expect most of the investors will be very eager to follow on. So I'd expect, so long as we do what we say we do, we'll be out into the market looking to expand the fund. We'll be launching a HGV-focused clean fuel fund shortly, and we're building a team at the moment for that. The other areas that I'm focused on is power, bringing in engineers into the business. So the unusual bit of this business is very few traditional property surveyors, and the ones that are broad thinkers, and much more logisticians and engineers and problem solvers. And the power piece, as we transition and decarbonise, you won't be able to run a business in real estate without having power experts. And so we'll be building a power piece to our business in pretty short order. And then in the future years, we've got a few other ideas for fund launches, years sort of 2 and 3, around cargo bikes as a service, hyper-local activity, how you're bringing not hundreds of thousands of parcels, but how you're bringing tens of thousands of parcels per day, a truckload, say, to a neighbourhood and distributing via CO2 neutral, possibly via cargo bikes. So we've got a few deals like that now. That's growing far faster than we thought it would, and think there's an opportunity there as well.
Amazing. So question that I ask at the end of every podcast is, if you're given £500 million worth of equity, who are the people, what property, and which place would you look to deploy that cash? I feel like we've probably covered all of that in this conversation. But if you had another cheque of £500 million, who are the people? And it could be a cross-sector of anyone that you've worked with previously or haven't worked with but have heard good things that you'd love to bring on board, the property and the place.
The people, dead or alive?
Yep.
Tony Pidgley. Why Tony? Only met him a few times. Brilliant connector of people. He was doing ESG 20 years before people talked about it. He understood how to grow a business, execute, and bring people along with you as you went. He really left a mark on me on how to be an inspirational leader. Share the positivity of building a great business, making a positive legacy, and then he didn't mind a bit of detail to see it through. So I think if Tony could come back and be my business angel and show me how to execute ideas, he'd be a pretty strong partner. I couldn't leave Bill Hughes out. He's a great mentor of mine. There's not many trends Bill hasn't spotted at LNG from when he took over from that real estate platform many years ago now. He's a picker of trends and a deliverer of value. So I'd put Bill on the team as well on the register. And then I'd actually, I'd put a no name to this because I'm just extending my network into this, but I'd go engineering. So I think the blurred lines of real estate advice will get much more towards, if you want to be a high quality real estate proposition to customers, you're going to have a deeper and deeper understanding of engineering. And if we're going to decarbonise and make a real difference on how we find an exciting planet that we all want to be party to rather than destroy it, I think there's a lot of engineering solutions that need to happen in the embedded carbon, in the operational aspects of real estate, and having some engineering skills alongside me, which then probably leads you to surprise, I've answered the exam question, which is where and when. It's interesting with London, I'm Aussie living in London. I've always said I think it's the greatest city in the world, and I couldn't I couldn't fault why you wouldn't be in London over the next 2 or 3 years, land market softened, opportunity looks terrific, and where would I be? I would be in the real estate and services as a service. So I would be in the space of the very difficult to replicate hyper-local logistics play, with providing services as well. So linking in what the fleet is, linking the entirety of the service package would be very difficult to duplicate.
So the operational angle.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed this chat, and look forward to seeing you absolutely smash it out of the park with your lofty ambitions and the team you assembled as well.
Super. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the People, Property, Place podcast. If you found it insightful, feel free to share it with a friend or colleague, subscribe, give us a rating, like or comment. It helps tremendously. It'd be great to hear from you on LinkedIn. I'm super open-minded to recommendations of which guests you think we should get on the podcast or areas of the market that we should explore further. So do drop me a message. The People, Property, Place podcast is powered by Rockbourne. The team recruit experienced talent for real estate private equity firms, investment managers, REITs, property companies and advisory firms across the investment, asset management, development, fund management, ESG, cap markets, investor relations and general practice space. So if you're considering your career options at the moment or looking to attract top talent to come and work for you, head over to the website www.rockbourne.com where you can find a wealth of resource to aid your search. Have a great day wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you next time.